The G20 is a meeting of the world's 20 biggest economies. The leaders of those countries get together each year to discuss global growth strategies. Moscow would like to remind host nation Australia that its aggression against Russia won't change the fact that President Putin represents the world's fifth largest economy. My guest tonight is the grandson of Vyacheslav Molotov, the prominent Bolshevik and Soviet foreign minister under Joseph Stalin. Named after his grandfather, Vyacheslav Nikonov is a Russian MP and chairman of the Parliament's Education Committee. He joined me from Moscow a short time ago. Vyacheslav Nikonov, welcome to Late Line.
My pleasure.
Can I ask you, what was your reaction when you heard the news that our Prime Minister had declared that he intends to shirtfront your president when he's here next month for the G20 meeting?
Well, it's not much of a news. You really need to look in the internet to get it. It's not on television, of course, and I don't think there is much attention to what's going on in Australia and Russia. I hate to say that. And probably 99% of the Russians would never hear a name of Australian Prime Minister. So that is not much of a news in Russia.
But you did know until just now that Tony Abbott, our Prime Minister, has said that he intends to shirtfront President Putin?
Yes, I've heard of that, yes.
Do you know what it means?
It's quite predictable statement, because Tony Abbott is known as one of the closest allies to the United States, and his political position is not at all different from that of Washington, D.C., and we know what they say about Russia in Washington, D.C. So it's not something which comes unexpectedly.
But what did you think of the comments?
Well, I think it's not up to the point. I think in general Australian position is counterproductive, because it is just supporting Ukraine. The regime of Ukraine, of course, is regarded as responsible for many war crimes here in Russia. They're responsible for killing thousands and thousands of innocent people in the east of Ukraine for nothing. And Australia is now just supporting that regime, and they're criticizing a very popular president of the Russian Federation, whose popularity is well over 80% and growing. As for his remarks about the need for investigation of the crash of the plane, this tragic event, we would definitely agree with that, 100%. The problem is that Tony Abbott already said who is responsible, though investigation is going on, and I would say it has not yet started, because there was not a single investigator, a professional investigator on site of the crash. Not from Australia, not from the Netherlands, or nowhere. They were not there. Besides, there were a couple of remarks by the now ex-defense minister of Ukraine and president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, who said that they have evidence that the plane was shot by Buk M1 missile. Buk M1 missile is a missile which is not used in the Russian army. It is a modification of that missile made by Ukraine during last decade. So it's a Ukrainian weapon. And why accuse Russia at this point, I don't know.
Well, Russian-backed rebels made it extremely uncomfortable for Australian and other investigators to make their way to the MH17 crash site.
Well, that's not true. From the very beginning, they did whatever they could to let the investigators in. Right now, there are no fights there. There haven't been any fights for the last month, and no one showed up.
Why did the former Australian military commander who was in charge there on the ground say otherwise?
He was not there. He was not there. That's as simple as that.
He was in Kiev, and he was in close contact with the Australian Federal Police and military personnel who were sent to the region to do the work of assessing the crash site, which we were told, certainly by officials, the crash site was contaminated, allowed to be contaminated from the very beginning. I mean, this is not the kind of cooperation Australia would have liked to have seen from Russia.
Well, first of all, it's not part of Russia. It is part of Ukraine. And it's part controlled by the rebels, by the coal miners, by the taxi drivers who really defeated the Ukrainian army. That's as simple as that. And of course, these guys, local people, were more than interested in getting international investigators to the site as soon as possible. And they were as cooperative as possible. All the bodies were recovered actually by the local rebels, not by Ukrainians or anyone else. They let all the OSCE observers in. They let every inspectors who were interested in coming in. They were providing protection to them. But as for the people who were searching the bodies, they were all in. And they were absolutely safe. They did their work fine. But as for investigation of the crash itself, the professional experts were not there, not a single one.
It was deemed very early on not to be a very safe site, given the fighting that was being carried out. And I'm curious to know whether you're suggesting that Russia had no involvement in backing the rebels.
There were many sides backing the rebels. There was no Russian forces there, for sure. If there were Russian forces, be sure Ukrainian army would have been defeated in course of days, maybe hours. Russian army was not there. It is local people who control the site, and international experts were there. But only the medical experts were there, and there were dozens of them. And they were absolutely safe, and they were protected by the local people. But otherwise, there were no Australian professional investigators of air crash. There were no Dutch investigators, no investigators, period.
Well, we had our Air Chief Marshal Angus Houston, an extremely well-respected military man from Australia who was in Kiev speaking to the deployed Australian Federal Police and military advisors who were there on the ground very close to the crash site, but turned away because it was deemed unsafe.
No, of course that cannot be true. Because otherwise, everyone who was interested in getting to the site of the crash.
Why are you suggesting that someone of this rank and respect would say such a thing if it were not true?
I don't know the person. I don't know how respectful he is. Maybe he is very respectful. I don't know. My feeling in general is that the West and Kiev are not interested in the investigation.
What efforts is Russia going to establish who exactly was responsible for firing the missile that downed MH17?
Russia provided all information it had, and Russian military, of course, had some information about the flight situation in the area. They had also information that there are quite a few Ukrainian jets there. They released the information that there were Ukrainian air defense systems deployed in that area a few days before. It was active, actually, during the crash. So Russia provided all information it could. And also it did everything to convince the authorities of Donetsk and Lugansk republics, which are now sort of autonomous in Ukraine, that they should provide all the assistance to investigation. And they did. I think they're more than anyone else interested in that investigation.
What are Russia's ambitions in Ukraine?
Friendly Ukraine. I don't think there are any ambitions more than that. And of course, Russia is not interested in anyone killing people in the neighboring country.
Why then do we hear that Russia has had thousands of troops massed on the border with Ukraine?
Well, first of all, because Ukraine, the authorities in Ukraine and their patrons in Washington need to somehow justify why the great Ukrainian army is suffering defeat. And of course, that cannot be otherwise than through Russia's, military intervention.
I'm not following you, I'm sorry. You just mentioned that Russia was not in Ukraine, and I've asked you why the troops are on the border.
Well, the Russian troops, well, there are no Russian troops on the border, first place. It's not about Russian troops being in Ukraine. They're not even on the border. Of course, at one point, when the war was on the borders of Russia, Russian troops were taken to the border because, among other things, the Ukrainian military authorities were pronouncing their ambitions of attacking Russia. So it would be wise to bring forces closer to the border. As of today, they're not there.
Well, Germany has recently estimated that somewhere between 500 and 3,000 regular Russian troops have been killed in the fighting in eastern Ukraine.
Well, this is German estimate, which I think does not hold water. There were no Russian regular military forces in Ukraine, period.
I've heard some commentators suggest that the Ukrainian conflict could potentially morph into a wider war between Russia and the West. What do you make of that comment?
Well, I know for sure that there are some politicians and intelligence persons in the United States who would like that happen, who would like to have a big Russia-Ukraine war. They really want to destabilize Russia. That's clear. But I don't think that's the mainstream thinking in the White House or in the State Department. So I don't think that's going to happen. And Russia, of course, is not in a fighting mood, not at all.
I wanted to also ask you about the fight against Islamic State. Just last month, President Obama said he had no strategy at all for dealing with IS in Syria. Is it clear to you now what the Americans and Australia and the other allies intend to do to combat IS in Syria?
Well, at this point, they're bombing the Islamic State areas, killing maybe one terrorist a day, which is not a strategy for sure. I think the strategy should be a really combined international effort, which would include the Security Council of the United Nations and all the countries involved, not just another coalition of the willing to bomb somebody. At this point, I think it's also critical to support the forces of order in that area. And these are the governments of Iraq. This is, ironically, the government of Syria, which was destabilized by the Western allies for so long, and of course Turkey, which is one of the key players in the area. They have really the desire, the forces, and the capabilities and the knowledge of the situation to deal with it, much more than the United States, Australia, who are not, I think, very constructive in the wider Middle East, not until recently.
Will Russia join the fight against Islamic State?
Russia will not join the fight under the American command, no question about it. But Russia will support the forces of order, as I mentioned, in that area, and that's what Russia is doing.
And finally, obviously, you know President Putin better than anyone here. I'm wondering what you think his reaction would have been to Prime Minister Tony Abbott's comments about him coming to the G20 next month.
Well, Putin will be coming to G20 summit, not to see Tony Abbott. And it is for G20 to decide who is coming and for what purpose. Of course, Putin will be there. He will be part of the discussion. Russia is the fifth biggest economy, and G20 discussing economy more than anything else. And for him, I think he would not like this remarks, but he got used to the rhetorics of the Western politicians. He would never say anything like that about any Western politician, even if he doesn't like him, because he behaves.
Do you think President Putin will have anything to say about the MH17 disaster when he comes to Australia, given we had 38 residents die in that tragic event?
Absolutely, he will have something to say about this tragic event, and he will really reaffirm the commitment of Russia to investigate this tragedy and really bring those who are responsible to justice.
Vyacheslav Nikonov, we're out of time. I thank you very much for coming to speak to Late Line tonight.
Thank you.